With no early exit from President Trump, was the G7 summit a success? Striking a less confrontational tone, leaders of the world's most powerful economies talked Iran, Ukraine, and trade. But is there substance behind the facade of unity, or will divisions over Russia and securing the Strait of Hormuz cause it to crumble? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the G7. Well, lightening the mood at the G7 summit this year was a preliminary deal the U.S. struck with Iran to end the war, a war which no other G7 country wanted in the first place. The Evian summit was a contrast to meetings past when disagreements over trade tariffs, the war in Ukraine, and even climate change led the U.S. to make some dramatic early exits. So did the friendlier tone of this year's meeting mark a real change in relationships? Or does the lack of clarity on where the Iran and Ukraine wars will go make it too soon to say? Here's a look.
Ending the Iran war and opening the Strait of Hormuz, the main items for leaders of the G7 countries, plus the EU and a host of others, as they descended on Evian in France. Those gathered represented up to 45% of global GDP. They were keen for updates and progress in ending a war that has disrupted global oil supplies, energy markets, and prices. The US president gave a reassuring update on the Memorandum of Understanding that the US and Iran are set to sign on Friday in Switzerland.
The deal's all signed, and the strait is already partially opened. As you know, they're doing a little hunting for a couple of mines that they've already found.
News that was welcomed by the leaders. Also joining the summit, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The ongoing Russian war with Ukraine is over 4 years old, but a new sense that Russia is crippled by war losses, and successful drone attacks on its oil infrastructure by Ukrainian drones has driven a heightened belief that Russia cannot sustain its war efforts much longer. European diplomats see the G7 as an opportunity to convince Trump that the US needs to take a harder stance on Russia to end the war in Ukraine.
Look, Russia should make a deal. Russia's lost tremendous amounts of people, and so has Ukraine. It has no impact on us, other than we sell weapons. We're thousands of miles away.
They believe previous proposals made by the US have been too favorable to Moscow. Europeans also wanted to signal that they are both willing to engage in talks with the Russian president, while simultaneously tightening sanctions on Russia and increasing support for Kiev. The G7 represents 10% of the world's population, but a disproportionate share of the world's GDP. But does the G7 have enough influence to do what the countries that comprise it say they want done? The Russian war in Ukraine has been going on for 4 years, and an end to hostilities with Iran stand on very shaky ground.
It's a memorandum of understanding, and if I don't like it, we'll go back to shooting at them, dropping bombs on their head.
Whether they can successfully formalize the end of one war and bring about the cessation of another is less than certain.
So what really was achieved at this G7 summit? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from London, Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics, Fawaz Gerges. From Washington, former national spokesperson for the Republican National Committee, Kevin Sheridan. And from Singapore, founder of the Knightsbridge Strategic Group and former defense strategy advisor to the UK government, Finley Grimble. Thanks all so much for being with me. Finley, I'll start with you. What do you make of this meeting? Was there real substance to it, or was it more about President Trump being able to kind of showcase this possible deal to end the war with Iran?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to remember is that this was very much a routine G7 annual summit. So there was no impetus or drive to bring about a big, substantial treaty or communique. So I think obviously the major focus became Iran and this, is there a deal, is there not a deal? And trying to get the G7 nations to give some sort of political legitimacy around the deal so that Trump can hopefully get it over the line.
Did they give that legitimacy?
Yeah, certainly. I think, if you look at the Canadian leaders' comments, very, very much wanting to frame the peace process and an eventual arrangement as very, very good, where he's been very willing to be critical of Trump in the past. So I think that the entire summit has given this idea of we're moving in a good direction. Whether we are moving in a good direction is very, very debatable, where we don't have the detail. There are contradictory statements coming from all sorts of areas, and Israel seems to be carrying on their campaign in Lebanon. So whether or not that legitimacy actually matters for a tangible deal is still yet to be seen.
Yeah, that's very important to consider in all of this, because, Kevin, President Trump made it very clear at the summit that this 14-point MOU is not final. And he said if Iran doesn't behave, he will go back to dropping bombs on their heads. So did he, in effect, bring something new to this G7, or is this potentially, do you even worry, a false start?
We don't know what's in the deal because nobody's seen it, obviously, but the markets like where it's going. The markets are all up in the last couple of days. So people are generally positive, but it's, until we see the actual MOU, the actual details of it, no one really knows. We're guessing at what's going on. Obviously, the Strait opening up is the big issue. And if that happens, I think we'll know that it's kind of a real deal. The money that could be going to Iran is the biggest potential flashpoint for the domestic audience here. So we just have to see. We're kind of guessing and just reading between the lines of what J.D. Vance has been saying so far, because he's been really the one that's been out there the most.
Okay, well, let me ask Fawaz what you make of, both those analyses. And this angle as well, if it's possible, do you think, that the U.S. is playing up the Iran deal because they needed to come to the G7 with something in hand, given not a single G7 member ever supported the war?
Oh, absolutely. And I think there was a sigh of relief among the G7 members. They were delighted that a framework of understanding was signed just a day before the G7 meeting. And the reason why, because Europe in particular and the G7 economies have suffered a great deal as a result of energy prices, as a result of fertilizers, and the chaos in the world economy. And I think this made this particular year the summit more cordial and less contentious. And I was really surprised by the joint communique, the flattery, great leadership, the joint communique said of Donald Trump, a breakthrough. Yet at the same time, if you read between the lines, the same final communique by the G7 said they cautioned that the hard work is yet to come, in particular when dealing with Iran's nuclear program and dealing with Israel's war in Lebanon, and also lifting the sanctions on Iran. I think all in all, what distinguishes this year's annual meeting from previous ones is that I think it was less contentious, less acrimonious. And I think at the end of the day, historically, such grand summits are really more symbolic and political than operational. What happens before and after the summit is much more consequential than really what happens during the summit itself. So all in all, I think European leaders are very happy that it did not really end in any kind of chaos as previous summits did.
Okay. Yeah, and if you say it is symbolic, fine, then the hard work is to come. And I have to ask what you make of arguably the personal sting that may have come with President Trump persistently mentioning what he calls the terrible Obama deal with Iran, that these European leaders worked years as well to negotiate and sign off on. Is it not kind of a personal insult to them and the horrible job that he thinks they did?
I think what we need to understand is that President Barack Obama is allergic to anything about Barack Obama, literally allergic. And I think everything he has really tried to basically sell this framework of understanding is that to say it's much better than what Barack Obama achieved in 2015. Yet everything that we know, in fact, I would not be surprised is that any deal that emerges out of the rubble of the US-Israeli war will be much worse than the 2015 nuclear deal between Iran and the great powers, including Barack Obama. And let me say why quickly, because I know our time is very precious. I think I remember President Trump on the night when the deal was signed. He said, quote unquote, "Ships of the world, start your engines and let the oil flow." President Trump celebrated a diplomatic victory, returned to the status quo, the pre-war status quo, because the Strait of Hormuz was open for shipping. Hear what Iran's foreign minister said on the same day. He said, "Our sword hangs over the Strait of Hormuz." Our sword hangs over the Strait of Hormuz, celebrating a major political and economic victory, a byproduct of the US-Israel war. So regardless of what happened, and Barack Obama, I was surprised, he said yesterday, he said, look, Donald Trump won't get any deal better than mine. And that's the reality. And that's really rattles President Trump. It angers him. It enrages him because there's something about Barack Obama that really unsettles the President of the United States, Donald Trump.
Okay, Kevin, I'll let you respond quickly. Go ahead.
Well, it's a better deal no matter what the deal is, although I will grant you the money could be a problem. The fact that America took out their nuclear capabilities and 80% of their missiles potentially, it's under rubble. Obviously, they could try to restart it. We could always go back with B-2 bombers and hit it again. That's better than what Barack Obama had, where he basically legalized their nuclear program up to a certain level of enrichment. Now they don't have a nuclear program, but they could try to restart it. So, yeah, it's messy. It's not great. There's a lot of people in America that are not happy with the way this played out. They're not happy with the fact that we did this at all. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, if the Strait gets open and Iran doesn't have a nuclear program that's functional, that's a better situation than Barack Obama put us in.
Yeah, we'd have to go back to another program to debate whether or not the nuclear program is still in existence in Iran, because Trump said he obliterated it in the 12-day war, and yet somehow we're still talking about how it needs to be done with. But anyway, right. Finley, I want to come back to you to something you said in your first, talking about the relationships and how they were reflected at this G7 summit. I mean, you even mentioned Mark Carney and Canada, and how it was just better this time between Trump and Carney both. But how carefully do you think other G7 leaders were considering how they personally behaved with President Trump? How calculated were their interactions when we even look at the German chancellor giving President Trump a World Cup jersey? How important were those little gestures to cultivating the image and the output of this summit?
So, yeah, particularly the European leaders, but Japan to an extent as well, they would have come into this summit with a plan of, let's put diplomatic pressure, be that through, positive praise or through, being a little bit harsher, on the United States, on the entire delegation, not just President Trump, to get this Iran deal done, right? So that was the primary thing here. Let's just move on from this whole situation. It's been disastrous. It hasn't achieved strategic objectives that the United States would have wanted. So let's just say, yes, Mr. President, please move on. Things are going well. I think the second thing is, the European leaders are always keen to show unity with the United States across the Atlantic whenever they can. They, for a long time, were willing to put up with Donald Trump being quite assertive on the need to spend more money. but over time they've become far more willing to be resistant. So I would not say that this G7 summit signals a move towards the end of them being quite, combative with one another. But absolutely, where they can, they want to show unity. They want to put up a shared front with Ukraine against Russia. They want to worry about the critical minerals issues with China. They want to have a shared idea of AI and the various risks. So, like I say, if they can be friendly with one another, they will. If they must be combative, they certainly will do that later on.
Finley, though, one of the things they did seem to agree on was increasing energy stocks by actually decreasing dependence on the Strait of Hormuz and supplies coming out of the Gulf. I found that really interesting, given their closest Gulf partners were in attendance there. And this is actually saying, yeah, we're going to try and move away from your markets because they are too precarious and risky. I mean, how does that really play out? Was this good for the unity of the body and those that were attending this conference?
No, look, I think the Gulf states are very willing to be pragmatic and logical about the need for diversification. I don't think that they would necessarily begrudge the Europeans or the United States or any nation for feeling that certain way. Obviously, the Gulf states want to keep their customers coming, right? But no, any geopolitical shock of this nature that brings about a clear, cross-government, across every government department in all of those countries, they'll be very, very wary now of what happens when we cannot access this key resource. So the top political level will have said to all of the apparatus of advisors and decision makers, please go out into the world and have a think about how we assure this does not happen again.
Yeah.
So I think the Gulf states will respect it, and I think it's a necessity to have as much diversification as you can in your energy supplies where possible.
Fawaz, let me ask you if there was, kind of something else at play off camera here, in that G7 nations are learning how to work with Trump while they have to, while also learning to live without the United States in the lead. Because as we mentioned, Canada and Mark Carney, he had said earlier that we need to look at an alliance of middle powers because this relationship with the US in the lead isn't working. Did you see elements of that at play in Evian?
Oh, absolutely. I think the big point, even though I agree that European powers want to show unity whenever they meet with the United States, I think what we are seeing now is that the G7 and Europe is trying to live with less America as opposed to more of America. And I think the reason why they flatter President Trump and make nice with him and quote him because they want to show unity. To give you an idea about what we have seen in the past few days, if the joint statement today reaffirmed the G7 commitments to the defense of the Ukraine, and they are united, quote unquote, in exerting more pressure on the Russian economy. This is the joint statement. Yet 2 days ago, what did President Trump said? He said simply, this is not our war, quote unquote, about the Russian-Ukrainian war. He said, it does not impact us at all. We're far away. All we do is to sell weapons. And that's why Europe is standing up now. Mainly, Ukraine is getting mainly European money and resources in order to purchase weapons. As a result, the bigger question is, we're really seeing a paradigm shift in the Gulf. More and more Gulf states now, the central question before the war was the extent of Gulf-Israeli normalization. That was the central question. The central question in the Gulf now is the extent of Gulf-Iran accommodation. I mean, this is a paradigm shift. More and more Gulf states, including the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, are coming to realize they have to live with Iran. Iran is not going anywhere. And Iran's sword hanging over the Strait of Hormuz basically impacts Gulf security, Gulf economy, soft power. And that's why when we say that at the end of the day, whatever emerges out of the rubble of the war, Iran now is more assertive, is less cautious, less risk averse, And this impact the Gulf and the European economies. And that's why it seems to me that the US Israel war in Iran really affected not only the world economy and the G7, it directly affected the Gulf economies and society, who have been the major losers of this war. Almost $200 billion the Gulf states have lost as a result of the war.
A lot to pick up on there, but Kevin, let me first have you pick up on the Ukraine issue, because Trump did say that he will push for peace in Ukraine, while at the same time, as Fawaz was pointing out, he said the Ukraine war has nothing to do with us. We sell them weapons. That's pretty much our only role here. And then kind of towards the end was said, okay, actually, we will make some effort here. Where do you think the position really stands for Trump on Ukraine? And could it change tomorrow anyway?
Oh, yeah, it could always change tomorrow anyway with Donald Trump. But I think most of America is kind of done with funding this and being involved in it at all. So he's just reflecting what the sentiment in America is. This should be Europe's lead role in, if they want to support Ukraine, they should. I certainly wish Ukraine well, but this is not primarily America's job to fix this situation. We should play a role in mitigating a peace deal if we can, but this is not our fight. That's just the sentiment in America, and you can love it or hate it, but that's where we are. In terms of the middle powers banding together, I think that's a mutual thing that America would be happy to see that happen. We don't need to be the world policeman. We don't need to be all over in bases, 700 bases all over the world. The Gulf states can join together and protect themselves from Iran. Europe can band together, fund their militaries, protect themselves from Russia. These are things that are a long time in the making, 50, 60, 70 years in the making. And, America has played a huge role in the world. But we're $40 trillion in debt now. And there's just too many things going on here that people are just done with it. They are. So
Okay,
I think the
but
next
then,
president will probably run on that message.
You're kind of describing the irony, though, that, it should have been America getting out and lessening its relationships militarily with Middle Eastern powers in particular, and instead they're now smack in the middle of the worst of conflict. But let me ask Finley, actually.
And he's getting out now.
We'll see. We've got 60 days to negotiate. And again, he said he will be happy to start dropping bombs on their heads.
True.
If he doesn't get exactly what he wants. It's premature to be saying that we're getting out.
True.
But let me ask Finley then, as far as the Middle East powers in attendance are concerned, do you think they feel any better about the positions they've taken re the US and Iran? Or are they, given what's come out of the G7 summit, are they reconsidering exactly where they stand now?
Well, I think that most policy advisors and strategists in the region will not be concluding that the Iran issue is over yet. I don't think that Israel are finished, and I don't think that Iran will tolerate Israel being aggressive in Lebanon and this deal lasting. So therefore, we're at a non-starter on that front. So I think it's still just very much a wait and see situation. If you take the kind of issue that you mentioned with what to believe that Trump says, I always advise private sector clients is look at what Trump signs, not what he says, because he's very willing to say a lot of different things in the media off the cuff, as he gets onto Air Force One, what's on his mind in that moment, what's been said in the last meeting. But what he actually puts down in communiques and potentially has digitally signed and potentially is going to be revealed in Switzerland later this week. Let's take a look at that, and then let's build a strategy based on that. But I don't think that any long-term decisions in the region will be taken until there's a tangible piece of paper, and then from there.
Well, even with that, when we're talking about relations, as you said, with Canada appearing at the conference, he ripped up NAFTA to give what was it called, the USMCA, Mexico-Canada trade agreement, and now that was signed and that was thrown out too. So I don't envy your position if you're advising people on how to respond to what the political strategy of President Trump might be going forward. But we've just got a minute left, so very quickly, Fawaz, one of the things he did say that stuck out to a lot of people was that he said we are now dealing with more rational people in Iran because we've basically killed the rest. Do you think that's true to any extent?
In fact, it's the reverse. What we are seeing now is the birth of a new radical generation of revolutionary guards with a new security doctrine. And the security doctrine is offensive defense. Iran now is willing to directly confront Israel and the United States anytime. It's no longer cautious. The strategy of strategic patience was buried in the rubble with the late Supreme Leader. So in fact, what President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu have done is to really basically create a new Iran. Regardless of what happened, post-war Iran will be much more assertive, much more resilient, much more on the offensive. And that's what really worries the Gulf state. And that's why the Gulf states now are really directly approaching Iran for rapprochement.
Fawaz, that will have to be the final word, unfortunately, for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to sincerely thank all three of my panelists so much for being with me, our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media. Do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.